Dan. Nice to meet you all. I am a brewer over at Wightknuckle. I used to work at my house for places and manage it's still there at the moment, the craft vegan beer from a place in Ryde yesterday. It's called Craft. That's how I got into this originally. The guys who were selling their beer. So I was going to run through a bunch of stuff for you. First of all, these are the beers that we stock for you guys. So the darker blues are pale ale. Probably going to end up being like the most popular one it is for a lot of people because it's I refer to it as our Coca-Cola beer. In that it has got enough for everybody, but it doesn't vary down kind of weird flavor profile too far that it might turn some people off. The IPA is hoppier. I will get on to hops in a minute if that doesn't mean anything to anyone. And then the faux lager essentially is our lager, so flavour-wise you're talking clean crisp. If anyone who's had something like Peroni is technically a Pilsner. Pilsner and lager, the words are interchangeable. They're essentially the same style of beer. We'll go into what makes them in due course. So yeah, these will be useful things to kind of, when you're dealing with customers or they'll ask. Do people ask you for drinks recommendations as far as the beers? I know with wine, obviously that's a big thing, especially when you do a lot of seafood here, you've got bulls as well, and I'm imagining that there's lots of probably, I haven't seen the wine list actually, but I can imagine New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc is a big one. Maybe Pitbull de Pinet as well, things like that.
It used to be, but we took it off.
Yeah.
Actually, they increased the price too much.
Okay, that died a death a bit.
Yeah.
We used to do that in the droves, but yeah, so I imagine New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, maybe the occasional oaky Chardonnay, something like that. But, so essentially, I would imagine a lot of the time if you're recommending to people, if they're having something light, crab or light fish, you're going to veer towards the lager. Good reason for that is that it's very delicate in the flavours, it won't overpower lighter foods. Do you guys do lobster? I know it's a speciality.
We sometimes,
Yeah.
our menu changes daily,
Yeah.
so we can get it in every so often.
Yeah.
It will probably be more like a lobster bruschetta or part of a lobster on a dish.
Yeah, if someone's having lobster, I would definitely say in that situation to go more towards the IPA. It can stand up to it. And also you find a lot of the time, especially in America, especially you're talking Maine, New England parts where lobster's a big thing over there, they have cared that heavy. You sometimes see them referred to as APAs, or American Pale Ales, and they are hoppier with these essentially American style hops, and I've got one in my trusty Jane Asher Tupperware to show you in a bit so you can kind of see what the flavours come from. But yeah, just to kick things off with how we do it. So, essentially, beer and the basis of all beers is a fermented drink made from grain malted barley for the most part, sometimes wheat as well. I've actually got some malted grains in the bag here with my trusty little peg. But yeah, if anyone wants to have a whiff of what's like, you might get similar things to. It's essentially not too dissimilar to what ends up getting used to make things like Ovaltine and Warlick. So if you've had malty things before, or malt loaf, if anyone's a fan of malt loaf, then you're well in on that sort of thing. Yeah. So that particular one is that's malted wheat. Yeah, and you kind of got to trap the stank and let it out a bit. But what we do with that is we'll make a different mix. You get different kind of what they call gradings of the malt roast. So depending on how dark it is like, is anyone a coffee fan as well?
Yeah.
So you'll know they do. Yeah, exactly. You'll know that they do different grades of roasting. Once you've had nice coffee from a coffee machine, fresh grounds, you'll know the difference as well between the different ways that they roast the beans. And so if it's lightly roasted, you'll get more of the kind of fruity flavours that come through, and the darker they roast, you get that bitter, rich coffee taste. Same thing with grains. So for pale ales and lagers especially, here's the process. Basically, you take the barley from the field, kind of grind it all down, and then you would essentially take your porridgey mix that you've got there, wet it, and then they do what's called malting, or take it to a malter, which they essentially wet it, take it to a warm, damp room, and let it start to grow. And as soon as it starts to germinate, they then stop it by kilning it to a various degree. So this is very, very lightly roasted. If you see one that's done for, like when we see the IPA, that's more amber in colour. They will roast it more. For something that's like a really dark, a stout or something like that, they will roast it till essentially it's almost gone black, and that will give you different flavours throughout the whole profile. Generally in the middle you start to get things, and this is why we do it with the IPA, they start to turn into what they call caramels. They take on caramelly, they get caramelised, they get sweeter, they give off these nice sugary flavours, and depending on how dark roasted they are, they don't ferment as much, if that makes sense. So when you make this porridge that I was talking about, where essentially you stick a load of this into hot water to about 60 to 70 degrees, leave it for an hour, and all the sugars inside that come out, just like let's say you make a big bowl of porridge. We then rinse the grain, lift it out, you're left with what's called wort. You may have seen the word before, St John's wort. It's something you used to be able to get down the chemist back in the day. And yeah, so essentially it's just a sugary mix that then we boil, add some hops to, because it's really, really sickly sweet. So what would happen is it would be almost undrinkably sweet by the time that you make it. So this is a hop called citra in here. It comes off the tree, it's a plant, it gets pelleted like this, and then you can add it, and feel free to have a crack of that inside and give it a sniff. And
You see it in a lot of ales.
Citra is probably one of the most popular
Yeah.
at the moment because it is named as such. It gives off very citrusy, very tropical fruit flavours. So I've got loads of it. Chuck it away. Yeah.
It's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad I didn't get pulled over with it because it looks suspect when you. Yeah, exactly. Well, no, that's what you bring the Jane Asher for. She gets me. Yeah, so it's a funny one that, because every now and again, do you get it where some people absolutely hate coriander? Because some people love it, and occasionally there's a gene where some people have it where it makes it taste like soap.
Yes,
Yeah.
like washing up liquid.
Yeah, we get the same thing with citras, or particular one. There are different, basically loads of different chemicals that go into hops that cause different reactions. And there's a particular chemical in there that for a small percentage of people it apparently smells like cat wee. I haven't come across it, but occasionally from selling these beers to people, you pour it for someone who's not tried them before, there's this faulty thing I've ever had. And then they say it tastes like cat wee, and then you say, why on earth do you know what cat wee tastes like? And then what's the dance we do? But yeah, so that particular hop is called Citra. That features in a couple of our beers. I think we started adding it to the black IPA. I want to say it's in the regular IPA, the red one. Showing my knowledge of exactly get to a point where you start doing it on autopilot after a while. But yeah, so the whole point of hops, and the reason that it's always been in beer for as long as they've been making it for the most part, is to add bitterness. They smell lovely and fruity, they are incredibly bitter. So you only add them in small amounts. Depending on where you add them when you're brewing the beer as well, can have a massive effect on how the beer tastes. If you add them right at the start of that boil, you generally boil for about an hour. Longer if it's a lager, because you want it to be really clear, you want to burn out the extra potential. I use the word chemicals and everyone thinks bad. It's just the stuff that naturally comes out. When it gets to brewing, you think of it like chemistry all the time, so it stops being about the kind of like the art of it, and you start thinking about, oh, there's a particular amount of alpha acids in this, and then everyone gets very bored, and so I don't talk about it anymore. But yeah, so if you add it at the start of the boil, they add bitterness throughout the entire thing. If you add them generally towards the latter half of your hour, they give off flavour to the beer so that it gets into the actual taste. And if you add it at the end, and sometimes after you've finished boiling, it's called essentially a post addition or a dry hop, which when you add it right at the end, that only gives aroma. But that's the thing, when you crack open a beer and you get that first whiff that comes off of it, that is all from the hops that have been added at the end. If you chuck them in at the end, they don't add any bitterness, but they also don't add any flavour or any other factors that you might want. So it's all of a juggling act of how we build beer from the ground up. Something like a lager doesn't have a lot of hops in it, or if they do have hops in it, they will go in at the end, because lager, being very pale, there's not a lot of sweetness in there like you would get from the dark malt, so you don't want a lot of bitterness. We're going to start trying them in a minute, and all these words I'm saying at you are going to hopefully make a bit more sense. So we might as well start at the lighter one, which is the lager. We've got Peroni as well here, which is your, I guess, your Pilsner equivalent. So yeah, we crack a couple of the faux lagers. We call it faux lager, interestingly, because the other additions, basically your main ingredients for beer are water, which everyone knows anyway. You've got your malts that go in there, so that is this stuff that gives you the general body of the beer. Then you've got your hops, which will give you the bitterness, and then the actual kind of fruity, or I say fruity, and sometimes it's piney.
Sorry.
No, not at all.
Yeah, we
You
probably
get
need a
piney
little bit.
flavours, you get woody flavours, a lot of very traditional English beers, and you'll find this with the Islander, they use more traditional English hops. They have a more, tea is a very common flavour that comes with English hops, along with pine and this kind of resinous thing that you can hopefully get. So depending on the hops we use. But yeah, so the other thing that decides what gives a beer its flavour a lot of the time is the type of yeast you use at the end. I didn't bring any of that because it just looks like, it comes in the same way as if anyone's done baking and you get the Allinson bread yeast, it looks the same. It's different, but... Oh,
Is that the Peroni one?
Oh yes, see, having a whiff. So we call this a faux lager because a lager traditionally is made with, they call it a lager yeast. It takes a lot longer than ale yeast. Not great from a business perspective because it takes about a month before you've even got something drinkable, and longer for it to actually kind of mature. We do it with ale yeast because we can get more flavour out of the hops in there. If you use a lager yeast, it takes a long time. They're very dry, they're very clean, which lots of people like. It's a bit like, does anyone like vodka as a drink? So a sign of a good vodka is about the filtration, and you know you've got good vodka because essentially it doesn't taste of anything. Similar thing with a lager, however the taste for that is changing. People are getting hops, so we start doing that. We use ale yeast, that's why it's called a faux lager if anybody asks why. It's still put through the same process of a lager is traditionally kept very cold in relation to ales. You ferment an ale at 18 degrees. Yeah, again, this is all kind of jargon, but lager is fermented colder than that so that everything drops out, because as the colder the liquid gets, you get less matter in there as well. It all drops out. So obviously when you look for a lager, you see this completely kind of crystalline, very pale drink. I mean, the Pilsner, the Peroni would be a prime example of that. That is about as clear as you get in the world of beer. And then ours obviously has a bit more to it because we use a different type of yeast, but it's the same kind of type. So flavours you should get off of that one. We use a hop, two hops, Hallertau, Mittelfruh. What's the other guy? Need to check. Which one's that? Mittelfruh? I thought I heard someone say something. Lovely, yes, Mittelfruh, and then the Magnum, which is a European hop. Those are noble hops, they're very traditional. They probably use Mittelfruh in Peroni. A lot of these big beers, they keep their hops very secret because they're their trade guided recipes. But chances are they'll be using Mittelfruh in there. It's a classic. It is the taste of European lager. So with the faux lager, you should still be getting nice clean flavours to it, a little bit of spiciness to it, maybe some floral hints as well, but it's generally quite subtle. We've tried to keep it quite subtle. We use a slight hint of a caramel malt in there to give it a little extra sweetness as well. It's why it's ever so slightly darker than the Peroni, because it would have been killed for slightly longer. On your menu, this one, as I say, would go with things if people get crab or anything light. Generally, if they're having something more like steak or a darker meat, then you would lean towards something more like the IPA if you're going for that. The other thing as well, I might as well crack it open now just to have a look at, is if you're doing this kind of thing, the wheat beer there. Do you ever have a wheat beer? I don't know if it's in
They've got Lopens there, and if anyone wants to get rid of any, just pop it in the bucket so you can pour
thought I'd work up light to darks, and that way we don't have to worry too much about rinsing out the glasses because the flavours won't be too overpowering. Yeah, feel free to do that.
Share this.
So we're brewing one of these at the moment, so I'm sending them loads ready. I'll see if I can
Little wheat beer.
Yeah. The reason it's called a wheat beer is because generally between half up to about half of the recipe is made with wheat malt, which is this one here again. It gives you a slightly sharper beer, slightly crisper. That's what you get in a lot of the lagers as well. When we make the lager, to give it that extra crispness, you change things about the water to favour different flavours. A lot of brewers add a small amount of lactic acid as well to a lager malt because it gives you that sharpness, that crispness, a little bit of bite. It works quite nicely with that
Oh,
style
we've got.
of beer.
Yeah, rather thank you.
Feel free to. So those two types of beer probably age your menu very well if you're going for lightness. If somebody's going for something with a little bit more of an intense flavour, you start to move on towards the pale ale. That would also go very well with a slightly stronger tasting fish. So if we crack a couple of these open as well.
So like a halibut?
Yeah, definitely.
That's so really good.
Very nice. Oh, that's actually quite a go-to.
That's a classic combo.
I've actually never had it before, so now we can try. It's like some people have Guinness and black.
Guinness and black, yeah, it's a classic.
What is with the lime and the black pepper?
Thank you.
Well, lime just goes quite nicely. Yeah. I mean, you just started adding. Yeah, so we do that with the hops now, basically. A lot of the time you used to get lime added to things like Sol, it comes served in the top of the bottle. And the story for it is basically saying that in hot countries where flies would try and get into your beer, the idea was that you stick the lime in the top of the bottle so you could leave it unattended and no flies. That is the story. The reason actually we get into it is because Sol and a couple of other those big lager brewers, their beer doesn't really have a lot of flavour. So by adding some lime, it does make it actually taste a bit nicer. But the story of keeping the fly out of the beer is very nice, so we'll roll with that. Yeah, so this is pale ale. All of it. So this one we generally describe as its floral, there's kind of berry hints to it as well. That'll be coming from the hopping. We've got a hop in there called Cascade, which is quite popular. That has grapefruit and berry characteristics to it. People get different hints of these as well, so if you're not picking stuff up straight away, then don't feel that you're missing out on something. Everyone has different taste receptors, in the same way that everyone likes different types of food. Some things you don't find very nice, some things you do, different to everybody else. You pick out these different elements, but we have these kind of broad flavours. So it's a bit sweeter, that one. So yeah, generally a lot of times, say where you said you're not really much of a beer drinker, chances are, and it was the case before I started with beer, if I went to a pub with my mates when I had a life, I would go and just get lager with everybody else, and because it's the main brand stuff and their business is keeping it consistent, they make it consistent by not making it taste of all that very much. So you kind of get used to this very dry, doesn't really taste of a lot, slightly bitter drink. Whereas when you get into the ales, which I always used to avoid like the plague, because I used to think, oh, ale, that's just like a flat old man drink kind of thing. They actually have loads of flavour to them. So yeah, with this one we kind of go for grapefruit, we've got a bit of pine in there as well, that comes with the other hops in there. And you'll see from the colour of the malt, it's starting to get that little bit more amber. So we get that by adding a small amount of caramel malts to that. That's what adds the sweetness in. As I was saying, so those malts get roasted a bit darker. In turn, as they get roasted darker, they don't, they give off sugars, but those sugars can't be fermented by the yeast, which is what you use to make any alcohol. So they get left behind. So generally the darker the malt, the sweeter beer. You generally find they're a bit thicker as well because that sugar doesn't get fermented. So like a lager where it's very thin and everything gets fermented. So you know they're closer to water than their actual kind of. We use the term mouthfeel. Some people find that word repulsive, but I generally find it's quite a good descriptor. As you get into the pale ale, a little bit thicker. As you get to stout, another thing that either turns people on or puts them off is they almost get slightly milkshakey in how thick they can be sometimes, or if you see them pour out as well, and then they sit there for you have to stop it halfway through and let the whole thing settle out because it's quite thick, and they're horrid to clean as well. They get stuck everywhere. So that is our pale ale. I would say that would stand up to stronger fish, so as you say, like halibut or something like that. Whatever the fish specials are. I know we used to do a lot of pale ales with free boys every now and again, things like the John Dory and things like that, and they really do stand up. If you're going between, probably from things I've seen on the menu, what would go quite nicely with the malts actually, especially if you're doing the marinara sauce, which I believe is the case. Yeah, so with the garlic and white wine in there as well. The IPA would be a nice place to move over to next. We're going to weigh that one up against the Islander as well. I guess that is where they're heading off to. A massive spill ahead
Thank you. I'll pour some of the Islander in.
Oh yeah.
Just so you can see what it's like.
Yeah. Only for a moment. There you go.
Chips with beer.
Oh no, it's alright, that's okay at the moment. I found my nice blazer and realised that I need to cram myself into it today, so avoid the chips. But, so next up, we've got the IPA, and then you've got the Islander as well. Now I don't know what hops they use in the Islander, I'm afraid. Again, they keep that one very close to their chest. But you'll see from the malt side of things that they're not too dissimilar. The difference you'll find is ours, it will be cloudier. We don't filter our beer. One thing you do get from filtering, so a lot of big breweries filter their beer. On the first hand, a lot of people who are used to seeing their beers and ales have always been fined and filtered. So you get a couple of different reasons for not filtering beer, and some good reasons for filtering it as well. So by filtering it, you remove a lot of the sediment. It looks more appealing. A lot of the use of finings actually goes back to, especially beers coming from cities. If you go back to London, you're talking 1700s. With a wide use of things like isinglass, which you might have seen in wine as well. You have to be aware of it because essentially it is from fish swim bladders. It means that the wine or beer in this case is not vegetarian or vegan. A lot of times when people are vegetarian or vegan, they will ask about it. So if you know that something is either unfined or they will specify that something suitable for vegetarians or vegans on drinks. That goes for alcoholic drinks across the board. So the reason they do it, aside from looking appealing, is that it adds life to the product by removing a lot of this sediment. It removes other potential things that could grow over time. There's yeast in alcohol, same thing as what gets dropped out. You might see this from when you pour bottles of wine at the end, you get told not to tip at the end there. The reason they have that divot, I don't know what the technical word, I'm going to call it a divot, in the bottom of a bottle of wine is so that you see at the end there's a sediment in there. That is the remnants of whatever yeast and potential matter was in the wine when they bottled it. A lot of the time in sailing beers you'll have something called sulfites in the ingredients. That's normally something called sodium sulfite. That is put in to stop fermentation, so that puts the yeast to sleep and makes it drop out so that you don't get beer little clumps floating around that you can't drink. We don't filter ours because one of the negatives of filtering your beer is you strip flavour. So we generally like to err on the side of having more flavour as opposed to not looking super crystal clear. Because we're spending the time and the money to put all these extra hops in for flavour, what happens as well is when you drop that matter out, the flavour of the hop is lost or dulls over time, but the bitterness that was added by them in the first place stays, and you get this weird thing where by the presence of the matter being in the drink, it adds the sweetness to counteract the bitterness. So if anyone ever asks why the beer is a bit cloudier, then it is unfiltered and unfined. We do it as a preferential, our reasoning is essentially to keep flavour. And so that we can throw all these extra hops and flavours into the beer. And it does, I say it lessens the shelf life, it takes it down to probably about a year to 9 months. So in an ideal world, it's selling in that time anyway. If you keep it in the fridge in good conditions as well, it'll last longer. But we always label our things generally between 9 to 6 months because we want them to taste as good as they can, and they generally go that quickly anyway. So never been an issue so far anyway. But you will see this, and people will probably ask about difference in clarity. But yeah, that's just why we do it.
One question.
Oh, please do.
You mentioned about the sort of traditional way of filtering beer and being vegan friendly.
Yeah.
Is there an alternative?
Yeah. So we use in ours. So we still do a fining process of some description. There's something called protoflock, which is essentially made from it's carrageenan, sometimes referred to as Irish moss. So it's from seaweed. You might have seen it in the kitchen as well if they've done. It's often referred to as a carrageenan, or you get agar as well, which is something similar. It's essentially vegetarian gelatin. So it does the same job in sets. So if you use it in a pudding, it's a set.
I used to use it in the Delices quite a lot.
Yeah, it gets a very similar finish. I mean, it will never give you quite like, if you're using a dessert, it will never give you quite the same thing as a jelly. Let's say like a blancmange or that kind of tight wibble. That's what it will do. But in a alcoholic drink as well, it will do the same thing, grabbing a lot of the sediment, dropping it out of suspension. So yeah, we use that. You get other ones. There's popular ones at the moment. It's mushroom chitin, which sounds interesting. Essentially, they use a particular protein that they extract from mushrooms that can do a similar thing. They throw it in right at the end, as you would isinglass or gelatin. Gelatin's more popular than isinglass at the moment because as soon as you say fish guts, people start to switch off. Gelatin, just comes in strips, so people aren't so very helped by that. So yeah, there are many things. I mean, it's a lot of the wines and beers, if they are very traditional, especially if they're European, chances are it's worth keeping an eye on them because they might use it, and then you might get a distraught vegan in your case. So it is good to know these things, and also it's quite nice when you're serving something. If somebody does request a particular wine, and you know that they've mentioned dietary requirements, and in that case saying that they are vegan or vegetarian, if they pick a wine, at least you can turn around and say, oh, just to let you know that one isn't vegetarian friendly, then sometimes they go for it or not. I have been a vegetarian for probably about 14 years, and when you go out to Michelangelo's and they come around with the parmesan, I turn a blind eye from time to time. It's quite nice. Just put it away, it's fine, I'm not going to talk about it. But some people obviously are die-hard and will fall on that sword, so it's good to know that it's there. Peroni is fine, by the way, as a beer. I know for a fact that is fine in a vegan vegetarian friendly way, so nothing to fear on that front. If somebody does ask, most people don't.
So all of these are vegan friendly?
They are, yes. Yeah, something that we made a point of doing. I want to say, because the head brewer is long-time veggie as well, and then basically most of the staff are just from, because a lot of us originated and met around this vegan restaurant I used to work at, so we all were anyway, all vegetarians, something like that. So when we all started working at the same place again, it was just part of it. But the bosses had it like that before, because essentially it means you can sell to everyone as well. You don't have to worry about it. It just makes things easier. I think a lot of products are going that way because they'd rather just sell to everyone. Was there any other questions about the way that the beer is made or anything like that? Or I was going to talk about the IPA and the actual flavour that goes into it. So this one, we've gone for the hopping that goes into it. We've lent into the grapefruit. There's also we've got a hop in here, one of my favourites. It's called Simcoe. It's an American hop. It pops up in a lot of American pale ales. It is biggest flavours that they go with for it is pine resin. A lot of the time, it's got a very kind of floral and kind of almost forest type flavour. There's a slight hint of I guess pine nut to it that comes through. To some people it doesn't come through, and then there's a bit of citrusy fruits through there as well. I guess it's if people have come across. Does anyone have like Brewdog beers, things like that? A very popular one of theirs is Elvis juice.
We've got that one.
Which is
We've
it's
stocked
absolutely
that one, yeah.
gorgeous. That has got a lot of Simcoe in it because they do infuse it with grapefruit. They do that more now, I guess, to get the flavour. When they first started doing it, I believe it was just heavy on the Simcoe hops. Punk IPA has it in as well. In fact, the first beer I brewed was I started working at that restaurant. I started whittering on at my wife every day about all the different beers because I had to learn it, and then she sadly was my target for all the information. And so she bought me a Brewdog Punk IPA brew your own at home kit, and then started with that. So that's where I first came across Simcoe hops. And yeah, it makes that really nice. I'm a big fan of that flavour. There's another hop that around that does that kind of thing, but a bit juicier, called Mosaic, that we've started putting into a lot of beers. It's very much that, but amplified again. It gets to the point though, sometimes with these things where it gets so hoppy, it's a love it or hate it kind of thing, and you'll start seeing Hazy Jane's another very popular one now. That's very hoppy, and then they also completely leave that unfined, unfiltered, because with all that extra hop that goes in there, they want that extra matter, like I was saying before, because it keeps the sweetness in there, otherwise it'd be completely unbalanced. A lot of making beer is all about figuring out balance, same as cooking, same as any of matching flavours, figuring out sweetness to bitterness, all these different bits that make the beer really, really pleasant. I might try a bit of the Islander if there's a glass going. I want to see what I'm up against. Is that going into, or is that been? No, I won't double dip.
So you mentioned that there's American hops in the IPA.
Yeah.
So what stops it from being an APA?
An APA, branding. That's
Right.
it. So the reason it's called an IPA is just a stylistic thing. Essentially, I think that's very kind of you. It's called an IPA because essentially you're going back to British colonialism with this. They would ship beers over to India and around the empire, and hops are incredibly antibacterial. So essentially what they would be doing is protecting the beer from going mouldy and any yeast that's in there, because the thing is they wouldn't have found it back then. I doubt you might get it with the bottles. You might have heard people asking about real ale as opposed to, and then they turn their nose up at other things and ask about real ale. When you go to the pub and you see the hand pump and it comes out of that, that's real ale, where essentially the beer has been made, it's been put into a cask or something, whichever